The planet's surface was harsh, the air thick with the acrid smell of fuel and rust. Overhead, the sky was a dull gray, streaked with distant smoke trails of incoming ships. The spaceport was alive with the sound of engines roaring and the murmur of shady deals being made in every corner. It was a place where the law had long since turned its back, leaving the inhabitants to make their own rules. Smugglers and bounty hunters, with faces hardened by battle and greed, moved among the crowded stalls, haggling for weapons, supplies, and sometimes, lives. Among this sea of grizzled and battle-worn creatures, an old man walked slowly. His gait was uneven, and his clothes were simple and worn. His face, marked by time, had a calmness that seemed out of place in such a violent, chaotic setting. His eyes, though clouded with age, were sharp, taking in the details of his surroundings. On his back hung a long, weathered blade, wrapped in cloth, as though it hadn't been touched in years. The bounty hunters noticed him almost immediately. A group of 5, sitting together near a makeshift bar, turned their heads. They were clad in armor, each piece bearing the scars of countless battles. Their leader, a tall, scarred man with a bionic arm, sneered as the old man approached. "Look at this," the leader muttered loud enough for his crew to hear. "What's an old relic like you doing in a place like this?" The others laughed. One of them, a heavy-set alien with 2 tusks protruding from his jaw, spat on the ground. "Must have taken a wrong turn. Probably looking for the retirement home." The old man said nothing. He continued walking, his pace steady, as though the insults had not reached him. His eyes flickered momentarily to the bounty hunters, then back to the path ahead. The leader stood, blocking the old man's path. "Hey, I'm talking to you." His voice was dripping with mockery. "Don't you know it's dangerous for someone like you to be walking around alone out here?" The old man stopped, lifting his gaze to meet the leader's. His face remained calm, expressionless. The leader's grin widened, mistaking the silence for fear. "You've seen better days, haven't you?" the leader said, stepping closer, trying to get a reaction. "Why don't you go sit down before you hurt yourself?" Another bounty hunter, a wiry man with a snake tattoo coiled around his neck, chimed in. "He probably doesn't even know where he is. Maybe he thinks this is some old market back on his homeworld." The laughter rang out again, harsh and grating. The old man stood silently, his hands resting at his sides. He made no move for the blade strapped to his back. His breathing was calm, unbothered by the taunts. The bounty hunters took his silence as weakness, their laughter growing louder, more brazen. "Tell me, old man," the leader sneered, stepping so close that the old man could smell the cheap alcohol on his breath. "Why don't you sell me that fancy sword of yours? Looks like you haven't used it in years. Probably just weighs you down." Still, the old man said nothing. His eyes drifted toward the horizon, where the sky seemed to darken as if sensing the tension building. He wasn't looking for an escape, nor did he seem to be calculating his next move. It was almost as if he was waiting for something, or someone. The leader, growing impatient with the old man's silence, shoved him roughly in the chest. The old man staggered but didn't fall. He caught his balance quickly, his feet steady on the uneven ground. For the briefest moment, the old man's hand hovered near the handle of his blade, but he didn't touch it. His fingers curled back into a fist, and he let them rest at his side once more. "Oh, come on now," the leader said, grinning wildly as he glanced at his crew. "You're tougher than you look. But not by much." The others laughed again, their voices echoing through the spaceport. They began to gather around, encircling the old man like predators stalking weak prey. The leader cracked his knuckles, clearly enjoying the moment. "Just give us a reason, old man," one of the bounty hunters growled. "I'd love to see what you've got left in you." The old man's eyes narrowed, and for a split second, something dangerous flickered across his face, something that made the bounty hunters hesitate. It wasn't fear. It was something much colder, something older. But just as quickly as it had appeared, the look vanished, replaced by that same calm expression. "Maybe he's got a death wish," the heavy-set alien said, grinning through his tusks. "Wouldn't be the first old fool we've put down." The leader took a step closer, his bionic hand humming as it flexed, ready for a fight. You should have stayed wherever you came from, old man. This place isn't for you. Still, the old man remained silent, unmoving. His gaze shifted briefly to the horizon once more, then back to the leader. He wasn't afraid. If anything, he looked prepared. But for what? The leader raised his hand, preparing to strike. The bounty hunters watched with eager anticipation, waiting to see the old man crumble. But just as the leader's hand began to descend, a shadow appeared on the far side of the spaceport. A figure was moving toward them, quickly, with purpose. The old man's eyes flickered, but his expression didn't change. He knew who was coming. The bounty hunters didn't notice at first, too absorbed in their game. But as the figure drew closer, their laughter began to die down, replaced by confusion. The leader's hand paused mid-strike, his attention drawn to the approaching figure. It was a woman, young, but with the same quiet confidence as the old man. She moved with the grace of a predator, her hand resting on the hilt of a blade far more menacing than the one the old man carried. The spaceport fell silent as she approached. Even the bounty hunters, for all their bravado, felt a shift in the air. Something was about to happen, something none of them had expected. And in that silence, the old man finally spoke, his voice low but steady. I warned you. The woman approached with an air of calm that was disarming, almost eerie in its precision. She moved swiftly through the spaceport, weaving between rough-looking smugglers and armored mercenaries without so much as a glance. Unlike the old man, she didn't go unnoticed for long, but at first, no one paid her much mind. After all, this was a place where strength was measured by scars and the number of weapons one could carry. She wasn't imposing. She wasn't a threat, at least not yet. Her presence was subtle but undeniable. Dressed in dark, form-fitting battle gear, her movements were fluid and efficient. The weapon at her side was sleek, an elegant contrast to the crude, oversized blasters and blades that lined the holsters of those who filled the spaceport. There was no doubt that this weapon had seen battle, but its pristine condition suggested that it hadn't been wielded in careless violence, but rather with precision and purpose. She neared the old man and the bounty hunters who had surrounded him, her eyes scanning the scene with a calm that mirrored her father's. The bounty hunters, still caught up in their mockery, paid her little attention. To them, she was just another passerby, too young and too unassuming to be a threat. One of the hunters, a large, brutish alien with a deep voice, was the first to notice her approach. He glanced her way, then snorted dismissively. What now? Someone send their daughter to fetch Grandpa? The others chuckled, barely acknowledging her presence. She stopped a few feet from the circle, her eyes locking onto the leader of the group, who still had his hand raised as if he were about to strike the old man. There was no fear in her eyes, only an unspoken warning. The leader turned to face her, eyebrow raised in mild surprise. And who might you be? His bodyguard? The others laughed, their confidence unshaken. She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze moved from the leader to the rest of the group, coldly assessing each one. Her father stood silent, his posture unchanged, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He knew she was here for a reason. You should leave now, she said, her voice steady, devoid of any emotion. The leader's grin widened. Leave? We're just getting started. Why don't you run along, sweetheart? This is no place for little girls. Again, the group erupted in laughter. One of the hunters, a wiry figure with a twitchy smile, leaned closer to the leader and whispered loud enough for all to hear. Maybe she's here to protect him. You think the old man's got himself a little secret weapon? The daughter didn't react. She simply stood there, her hands at her sides, her expression unchanged. Her lack of fear unnerved the hunters, though none would admit it. They were too caught up in their arrogance, too used to being the ones in control. The leader took a step toward her, his bionic arm humming with power. Tell you what, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. We'll let the old man go, if you can make us. For a moment, no one moved. The air was thick with the kind of tension that only happens when something inevitable is about to unfold. Her fingers twitched, just barely, and before the hunters could react, her hand was on the hilt of her blade. In one fluid motion, the weapon was drawn, its edge catching the dim light of the spaceport. The movement was so swift, so precise, that for a second, the hunters didn't even register what had happened. The leader, now mere inches from her, froze mid-step, his cocky grin faltering. The blade hadn't struck anyone, but its mere appearance had changed the mood instantly. The daughter held the weapon at her side, relaxed, but there was no mistaking the deadly intent in her posture. This was no ordinary blade, and she was no ordinary fighter. The leader's eyes narrowed, but he didn't back down. "You think that's gonna scare us?" he sneered. "I've seen plenty of fancy tricks before." She didn't respond, her silence speaking louder than any words could. The rest of the hunters shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something was different now. The casual arrogance that had filled the spaceport moments ago was beginning to dissipate, replaced by an undercurrent of uncertainty. "I warned you," she said again, her voice calm but carrying an undeniable edge. The leader, determined not to lose face in front of his crew, lunged at her, his bionic arms swinging wide in a powerful arc. But she was faster. Much faster. With a single step, she was inside his guard, her blade flashing once before she pivoted away. The leader stumbled, his arm now hanging uselessly at his side, the mechanism inside short-circuited by the precise strike. He hadn't even felt it happen until he tried to move. The rest of the hunters stood frozen, caught between disbelief and fear. One of them, the wiry man with the snake tattoo, reached for his blaster, but the daughter was already moving. She disarmed him with a single strike, the barrel of the weapon sliced cleanly off before he could fire a shot. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The daughter stood at the center of the circle, her blade gleaming, untouched by blood. She hadn't needed to kill anyone, not yet. The message was clear, she could have ended them all, if she had wanted to. The bounty hunters exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado now gone. The leader, clutching his useless arm, glared at her through gritted teeth. What are you?" She finally sheathed her blade, her movements slow and deliberate. "I am what you've been warned about." Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The hunters knew now that this was no ordinary confrontation. They were dealing with something ancient, something dangerous that they had long since forgotten. Without warning, the daughter moved, her blade a blur of silver as it sliced through the air. The first bounty hunter barely had time to react before the edge of the blade found its mark, cutting through his defenses with a deadly precision. He collapsed, his weapon clattering uselessly to the ground. The others stood frozen for a moment, unable to comprehend how quickly the tables had turned. Her movements were fluid, each step calculated and deliberate, her blade cutting through the gaps in their armor with surgical precision. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. Every strike was purposeful, every dodge instinctive. She didn't fight with brute force, she fought with a level of skill and finesse that none of them had anticipated. Another bounty hunter charged at her, blaster raised. She sidestepped effortlessly, her blade deflecting the shot as she closed the distance. In a heartbeat she disarmed him, the blaster falling to the ground in pieces before she finished him off with a swift, clean strike. It was over in seconds, and yet it felt like she had been in complete control from the moment the fight had begun. The remaining bounty hunters were no longer laughing. Their arrogance had dissolved, replaced by confusion and a rising sense of panic. They had underestimated her, thinking her youth and size meant she was no threat. Now they were realizing just how wrong they had been. She didn't just fight them, she outsmarted them. One of the hunters tried to flank her, aiming to catch her from behind. But she was already one step ahead. Using the terrain to her advantage, she ducked behind a rusted-out ship hull, forcing him into a narrow alley where his size worked against him. With a quick, decisive move, she trapped him, her blade ending the fight before he even understood what had happened. Another hunter, desperate, reached for a grenade at his belt. He pulled the pin and threw it in her direction, thinking it would force her into the open. Instead, she used the environment against him. With a flick of her wrist, she knocked the grenade back toward him, sending him scrambling for cover. The explosion rocked the spaceport, but when the dust settled, she was still standing, unharmed. Throughout the battle, the old man watched in silence. His eyes followed every movement, assessing each situation with a calm, practiced gaze. He wasn't passive, he was observing, guiding her with subtle gestures, a nod here, a glance there. It was clear that while he no longer wielded the blade himself, his mind was as sharp as ever. She wasn't just fighting alone, she was executing the tactics he had drilled into her for years. "Behind you," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't hesitate. In one smooth motion she spun, her blade cutting through the air to meet the next attacker. The bounty hunter staggered back, clutching his side, his expression one of disbelief. She had reacted before he even had a chance to strike. The bounty hunters were now beginning to realize the full extent of their mistake. This wasn't a fight they could win. One by one they had fallen, and it was becoming clear that none of them were a match for her. Panic set in, and they started to retreat, scrambling for the exits. But she wasn't done. With a sudden burst of speed, she closed the distance between herself and the nearest fleeing hunter. Her blade flashed again, and he went down, his weapon slipping from his grasp. She was relentless, giving them no quarter, no chance to regroup. Another tried to escape, but she was faster. Her blade found its mark, and he too fell, joining the others in the dust. The leader, the last one standing, was backing away, his eyes wide with fear. The bionic arm that had once made him so confident now felt like a liability, weighing him down as he tried to retreat. He had underestimated her from the beginning, and now he was paying the price. "You don't have to do this," he stammered, his voice shaking as he backed into a wall. "We can." His words were cut off as she advanced, her blade raised, her expression unreadable. She stopped just short of him, her eyes cold and steady. "Your arrogance is what brought you here," she said, her voice calm, devoid of emotion. "This was never a fight you were going to win." He tried to respond, but there was no time. With a final, swift motion, she ended it, the sound of his body hitting the ground echoing through the now silent spaceport. The fight was over. What had started as a game for the bounty hunters had ended in disaster. They had mocked the old man, dismissed the daughter, and now they lay scattered, defeated by a force they hadn't seen coming. As the dust settled, the old man finally approached, his steps slow but deliberate. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at the bodies of the fallen hunters. There was no gloating, no satisfaction, just quiet acceptance. This had been necessary, nothing more. "You did well," he said at last, his voice soft but full of meaning. The daughter sheathed her blade, her expression still unreadable. She didn't respond, but she didn't need to. The bond between them spoke louder than words. He had taught her everything she knew, and now she had proven herself beyond any doubt. The bounty hunters had come here thinking they were the predators. They had laughed, they had mocked, but in the end, they had learned a lesson that would echo throughout the galaxy: never underestimate a human. The last of the bounty hunters lay on the ground, gasping for breath, his weapon too far from his grasp to make any difference. Blood trickled from a deep gash along his arm, his desperate attempts to crawl away futile. His eyes, wide with fear, were fixed on the daughter as she approached, her steps measured, deliberate. He tried to beg, tried to plead for his life, but the words caught in his throat. Before he could utter another sound, it was over. Her blade flashed once more, swift and decisive, and the final hunter slumped to the ground, the fight drained from his body. The spaceport was silent now, save for the faint hum of distant ships and the soft wind carrying the dust of the fallen. There was no longer any threat, no need for further violence. The battle had ended as quickly as it had begun, and the daughter stood alone among the wreckage. The old man, still standing where he had been, approached her slowly. His steps were calm, his face unreadable. He stopped beside her, looking down at the bodies scattered around them. There was no triumph in his gaze, no satisfaction, only the quiet acceptance of a man who had seen far too many battles in his time. "They thought they could mock us," the old man said quietly, his voice low, almost reflective. They never learn. For the first time since the battle had begun, the daughter relaxed, lowering her blade. Her breathing steadied, but there was no sense of relief, no sense that the conflict had truly ended. She looked to her father, waiting, knowing there was more to come. He hadn't spoken much during the fight, hadn't revealed what lay behind his silence. Now, with the dust settling, she sensed the weight of years that hung on him. "They don't know who you are," she said, her voice soft but steady. The old man chuckled, though it was a sound without humor. "They don't need to. Not anymore." He paused, staring at the horizon as if lost in thought. "Once I was like them, young, strong, eager to prove myself. I led armies, fought in wars that no one remembers now. I thought I could shape the galaxy, leave a legacy that would outlast the stars." He shook his head slightly, as if to dismiss the memories. "But time teaches different lessons. You see the truth as you grow older. No matter how many battles you win, no matter how strong you become, it's never enough. The galaxy forgets. And eventually you leave it all behind." The daughter listened quietly, letting the weight of his words settle in the air between them. She had always known there was more to her father than he had ever told her. The scars, the quiet way he carried himself, the unspoken wisdom in his eyes, they had all hinted at a past she had never fully understood. "But you didn't leave it all behind," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. "You trained me. You passed it on." The old man smiled, but it was a tired smile, one filled with the knowledge of someone who had seen too much. "I trained you because I knew the galaxy would forget us. They laugh at our traditions, think we're relics of a past they've outgrown. They've forgotten what it means to fight with honor, with skill. But we haven't." He gestured to the fallen bounty hunters around them. "They never stood a chance because they didn't understand. They thought strength was enough, that brute force could win any battle. But they were wrong." The daughter nodded, understanding now more than ever the lessons he had taught her. It wasn't just about fighting, it was about surviving in a galaxy that had long since moved on from the old ways, a galaxy that underestimated those who still held on to them. "They'll keep underestimating us," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "And we'll keep proving them wrong," the old man replied. His eyes softened as he looked at her, a quiet pride in his gaze. "You've become more than I ever could have hoped for. You've made them see." For a moment they stood in silence, surrounded by the remnants of the battle. The galaxy was vast, uncaring, but here, in this moment, they had made their mark. It wasn't about legacy or glory, it was about surviving, about showing the galaxy that humanity was far from the weak, frail race so many believed it to be. "They'll remember this day," the daughter said, looking out at the horizon. "Even if they don't remember us." The old man nodded, his eyes distant. "Maybe. Or maybe they'll forget, just like they always do. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that we know." As the wind began to pick up, scattering the dust of the fallen into the air, the two of them turned to leave. The old man's blade, still strapped to his back, remained untouched throughout the entire battle. His daughter's blade, now sheathed, had done all the talking. The quiet power of their shared strength, passed down from one generation to the next, was all that remained. They walked away from the spaceport without looking back, leaving behind the silence of the dead and the echoes of their triumph. The onlookers, those who had witnessed the fight from the shadows, stood frozen in place, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. They had seen something they would never forget, even if they didn't fully understand it. As they disappeared into the distance, the galaxy continued to spin, indifferent to the events that had unfolded. But somewhere, in the hearts of those who had witnessed the fight, a small seed had been planted, a reminder that humanity was not to be underestimated. The old man and his daughter had proven, once again, that strength wasn't just about power or numbers. It was about resilience, adaptability, and the quiet determination to survive in a galaxy that had forgotten what true strength looked like. And they would continue to prove it, for as long as the galaxy continued to underestimate them.